Have you ever heard of odious debt? It's this really powerful, kind of controversial idea that mixes up global finance, international law, and this deep fundamental question of what's fair. I mean, really think about it. Imagine someone steals your identity, goes out and racks up a massive loan in your name, spends it all on things that actively make your life worse, and then, poof, they're gone. And guess who's left holding the bill? You are. Sounds like a total nightmare, right?
Well, for millions of people around the world, this isn't some hypothetical thought experiment. It's the very real, very painful reality of what's called odious debt.
All right, so how on earth does an entire nation get stuck in a trap like this? Let's break down how it works. It's kind of like a dictator's playbook. The playbook is tragically simple, and honestly, terrifyingly effective. First, a repressive leader grabs power. Then, they immediately hit the international markets, borrowing billions of dollars, all in the country's name. But here's the thing, that money isn't building schools or hospitals. Oh no, it's funding their personal palaces, it's buying weapons to crush dissent, or it's just straight up stolen. And then, the kicker. When the people finally manage to overthrow the tyrant, the new, often really fragile government gets a knock on the door. It's the international creditors, and they're told, you have to repay those loans or we'll cut you off from the entire global financial system. And this isn't just theoretical. This has happened time and time again. I mean, just look at Nicaragua back in the 70s. The dictator Anastasio Somoza basically plundered the entire nation. And after he was overthrown, the new government was pressured hard to repay his debts, just to stay on good terms with the West. The people were literally forced to pay for their own oppression.
Okay, so what does the world usually do about this? Well, the go-to tool in the toolbox is usually trade sanctions. But you're going to see that this tool often does more harm than good.
Yeah, there's this massive disconnect between what trade sanctions are supposed to do and what they actually do. The goal, right, is to punish the dictator, to squeeze the regime. But in reality, the economic pain often hits the general population the hardest. And on top of that, these sanctions are notoriously leaky. There's always some third party, some other country willing to bend the rules for a quick buck, which just undermines the whole effort. So, if trade sanctions are this flawed, blunt instrument, what's the alternative? Well, that brings us to this really powerful legal concept, the Doctrine of Odious Debt. The basic idea here is actually super simple. And, it just makes sense. It says that if a debt was taken on by a dictator without the people having any say in it, and if that money wasn't even used to help them, then that debt is odious, it's illegitimate, and the people shouldn't be on the hook to pay it back, period. And this brings us right back to that credit card fraud analogy we started with. The whole idea is to treat the nation itself as a victim of identity theft. The dictator fraudulently ran up the charges, so why should the nation be liable? The logic is, it's really hard to argue with, right?
Okay, but wait a minute. If this idea is so simple and so just, why isn't it just standard international law? This is where things get really complicated, and it all comes down to a problem of timing.
So you got to be asking, right? If the concept is so clear, so obviously fair, why isn't this happening all the time? Well, the short answer is one word: fear.
Lenders, the big international banks and financial institutions, are absolutely terrified of what they see as a dangerous, slippery slope. They're worried that if you create a system where debts can be canceled after the fact, then any country could try to use it as an excuse to weasel out of legitimate loans. And that kind of uncertainty, they argue, could crash the entire system, making creditors too scared to lend money to anyone. So, it all boils down to this critical issue of timing. The old way of thinking about this is what lawyers call ex post. That means after the fact. You wait until the dictator is gone, and then years later, some court tries to rule on whether the old debt was odious. You can see how that creates massive uncertainty for every loan out there. But what if you flip the script? What if you could make the ruling before the loan is even made? This is the ex-ante approach, before the fact. And this is the key insight. You declare a regime's future borrowing odious, right now, ahead of time. And that powerful idea, that ex-ante approach, leads us straight to the innovative solution proposed here, a proactive system of loan sanctions. Okay, so how would this actually work? Well, the process is surprisingly elegant. Step 1. The international community gets together and officially declares that any future loans to a specific named regime will be considered odious. Step 2. key financial players, think the US, the EU, pass domestic laws saying that their courts will not enforce repayment of these specific future loans. And that leads almost automatically to step 3, the lending just stops. I mean, think about it. Why would any bank in its right mind lend millions of dollars if they know for a fact there's no legal way to ever get that money back?
So the big question is, does this new tool, this loan sanction, actually solve the problems we saw with those old-school trade sanctions?
And when you put them side by side, the difference is just, wow. Trade sanctions are fragile, right? Because there's always a financial incentive to cheat. But loan sanctions, they're self-enforcing. The lender's own self-interest, their desire not to lose money, makes them comply. And while trade sanctions can really hammer the general population, loan sanctions actually protect them from being saddled with more illegitimate debt. It's like using a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer.
And just think about where this could have been used. Back in the 80s, the apartheid regime in South Africa was under trade sanctions, but guess what? They were still getting loans from private banks. A loan sanction could have choked off that financial pipeline. Same thing in Croatia in the late 90s under Franjo Tuđman. He was looting public funds while still getting billions in commercial loans. This could have stopped that cold.
And that's really the bottom line here. Instead of punishing a country's people for the sins of their rulers, loan sanctions punish the regime itself by cutting off its credit line. It targets the rulers, not the ruled.
But of course, this isn't a magic wand. And it leaves us with one final, absolutely crucial question. Who gets to decide? Who should have the power to label a regime odious and pull this financial trigger? Should it be the UN Security Council? An independent international court? Figuring out who gets to be the judge and jury, that's a monumental political challenge. But it's a question we absolutely have to start asking if we ever want to break this vicious cycle of the dictator's debt trap.